Hello and welcome to this year's Yom HaAtzmaut lecture. This is the lecture that I would normally give on a Shabbos morning, usually directly after Yom HaAtzmaut. Now, for those who are watching on YouTube, you will need a source sheet for this lecture. This source sheet is available from the link that appears below the video, just below the video in this presentation. Others will have received it directly. This year's topic is what I hope will be quite exciting. It's called Proto-Zionism and a Letter to Baron Rothschild, the visionary Chutzpah of Rabbi Hirsch, Kalischer. And this requires some explanation. I'm going to begin by looking at page 1 with some pictures to give some sense of the characters in this story, a remarkable story that was going on in the mid-19th century, which is really before Zionism formally became a movement. But Rabbi Hirsch Kalischer and his contemporary, both of them were students of the great Rabbi Akiva Eiger, Rabbi Eliyahu Guttmacher, are regarded as proto-Zionists, rabbis of the traditional school who espouse strong what we call today Zionist leanings and teachings. And we're going to study Rabbi Hirsch Kalischer. Now, we don't know all that much about the details of his life, and you can see some images here in section A, images and timeline. On the first line, there's a standard picture from which all are drawn, a painting which appears on the left. In the middle, there's his signature, which is drawn from the document that is going to be the focus of our study. And then there are a couple of stamps that have been issued by the State of Israel to commemorate him. In Torun in Poland, where he was the rabbi, there's a memorial plaque, and here I managed to capture from Google Maps on the bottom right of the images Rehov Kalischer, which is a longest street in Tel Aviv, to commemorate him. And you can see from the timeline that he was born in Lissa, which was a centre of Jewish scholarship, then in Prussia, now in Poland, in 1795. He became a student of the great Yaakov Melissa, Yaakov Loberbaum. But most importantly, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and for his life, throughout his life, he would sign himself as a student of the great Rabbi Akiva Eiger, perhaps the greatest Talmudic genius of the era. In 1820, he marries a woman called Gittel from Nishava, which is not very far from where he grew up, and we don't know very much about her, and they settle in this place called Torun, now Torun in Poland. He comes to prominence when he's about 40. And this is going to be the focus of our study. In 1836, Rabbi Hirsch Kalischer writes a letter, an extraordinary letter, to Baron Amschel Meir Rothschild. More of that shortly. In 1862, he publishes a book called Drishas Zion, Seeking Zion, which has become a very popular text for religious Zionists. It's quite a short book. It's available in several editions. He published many other works, but they're not germane to our study today. He was active in establishing committees and various groups campaigning or supporting the settlement of Jews in the land of Israel. You can see here one in 1864, the Central Committee for Settlement of the Land of Israel in Berlin, and he dies in the place when he spent most of his life in Torun in 1874. Skipping to the bottom of the page, the passive player, and I'll explain why I say that shortly, in our story, this is Baron Amschel Meir, or Asher Amschel, as he was known in Jewish circles, von Rothschild. He is a contemporary-ish, slightly older than Kalischer. He was born in 1773 as the second child and elder son of the famous Meir Amschel Rothschild, who was the founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, and his mother Gutla, who was from the Shanapa family. In 1796, in his 20s, Rothschild marries Eva Hanau. They have a very, very long and happy marriage, although sadly they were childless. In 1812, Meir Amschel, and they are confusingly called, the father's called Meir Amschel and the son's called Amschel Meir. So there's lots of confusion. If you look them up online, you need to make sure you're getting the right one. Meir Amschel, the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, dies, and Amschel Meir as the oldest son, succeeds him as head of the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt, although by then there were branches of the Rothschild Bank in different places. In 1817 and 1822, he's ennobled in various ways, becomes Baron von Rothschild, and he dies in 1855. And as sadly they were childless, the business was taken over by his nephews, the sons of his brother. In these images here, you can see there's an Oppenheimer painting on the left, another here, him engaging in some kind of plenipotentiary activity, and then there's an image of his grave in Frankfurt on the right. If you turn to the second page, it facilitates our conversation. It's not really a dialogue or a sequence or an exchange of correspondence. In 1836, and we'll see perhaps why this date was significant, Hirsch Kalischer wrote a seminal letter to Rothschild. The manuscript exists, and there is an image of it at the top of the second page, and beneath there are two magnified parts. You can see that the manuscript is not in such great shape. The top is torn, and there are various holes and tears, and the transcript of the text into a readable form has various gaps, including right at the top, where you can see that the poem that he writes at the beginning is partly damaged on the left side. It's written by hand on what appears to be quite a large piece of paper, and you can see the detail on the top right of the image is replicated below. On the next page, we're going to look at an easier read version of these. This is a summary of his intention in the letter, and then there's a little poem that he writes in praise of Baron Rothschild, which is replicated below. So Kalischer writes to Baron Rothschild, and in essence he is asking him to kickstart what we would call today a Zionist revolution. But the best way to find out what that's really about is to look at the letter itself. So if you turn to page 3, now once we've finished with those images, you turn to page 3 on your source sheet, you will see the beginning. I made a decision. It's a very long letter. I read it from beginning to end. It's about 14 pages, and it's written in, at least the opening parts, in a very flowery, rather reverential tone, and we'll discuss that as we look at some of the texts. There are various poems and introductions, but a very large part of the letter is occupied with what I would call lomdus, meaning technical halakhic argumentation to discuss and refute certain concerns. Because Kalischer, as we will see, is a messianic proto-Zionist, and perhaps it's not clear what that means, is that he was all for returning to the land. He wanted Jewish sovereignty in the land, but primarily to usher in a messianic era in which it would be possible to fully observe all the mitzvahs hatuluyos ba'aretz, all the mitzvahs that were contingent on the land, for example, tithes, the Shemitah 7th year, the Yovel, the Jubilee, and so on. As well as, and this was his special focus, and there was much correspondence later than this letter in the 1850s and 1860s, he particularly wanted to take Jewish control of the temple site, so it would be possible to rebuild the temple or to have some kind of temple substitute in the meantime and restart the sacrificial worship, which he believed was absolutely central to Jewish life. And he argued very strongly that that would be possible even in an era where there was no temple, even in an era where most people were ritually impure in the absence of the red heifer, and even in an era where we were not absolutely certain who were legitimate Kohanim, priests, to carry out the divine worship on behalf of the Jewish people. At least 8 of the 14 pages are consumed with those technicalities. He raises the issues and then he dismisses them. I've decided to omit that completely, but just to mention it to the audience. What I am going to do is to look at the letter and its introduction, and then pick out 3 or 4 salient passages, all of which are available in English. But I do just want to look at a little bit of the introduction, and as I said, you can see, if you glance back at the previous page, that some of this letter has been damaged, and so we're not exactly sure what all the words at the beginning mean. But we're citing mostly from Jody Meyer's translation. I drew heavily on a book by Jody Myers, a contemporary academic, which is an excellent study of his messianic and Zionist leanings written in English. So I drew from her book, and it's attributed where appropriate. So the letter begins, and these are the only parts that I'm going to look at in the Hebrew, and the rest of the sources, as you'll see, are entirely in English. Poi Toran, here in Toran, which is where, as we say, he was resident. He wasn't actually the rabbi; he just lived there as a sort of scholar, probably studying and writing most of the time, and we assume it makes reference to God. God may be blessed, may he be blessed, but the rest of it is cut off, and you can see the letters written on the 12th of Elul, 5596, which corresponds to the 25th of August, 1836. Now, what I'd like you to do is first read Jody Meyer's translation of this little introductory poem. Glorified you see him, a noble and lord in Israel. Many nations pay him tribute, for his purse is ample. Men of understanding seek to learn why his cloak is red, his helping holy shield, and then there's a bit that's indecipherable. Surely he is from the stock of Jesse, a sprout from Judah bearing fruit. The shield of his banner reddens, his breastplate is righteousness, and a helmet of salvation lies upon his head. You'll identify straight away that this is a paean to Rothschild. The red shield reference is obviously Rothschild is Rothschild, which means a red shield. That's the meaning of the name. But you can see that Kalischer describes Rothschild in a messianic guise. The stock of Jesse. That's a phrase that is familiar or in some form from our liturgy. Ben Yishai means King David. It's a reference to the Messiah, a sprout from Judah. The kings of the Davidic dynasty come from the tribe of Yehuda. So because he is very wealthy, he has the means to affect the destiny and usher in the Messianic era. I'm not going to go back and look at all the Hebrew, but if you could look at the passage at the top of the page, which was Hadar Oisom Ra'u, or Oisom Atem Ra'u. But you look down the page, Hey, Sin, Resh, Aleph, 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 Mem, and on the left column, Shin, Lamed, Vov, Mem, Lamed, Vov. And if you look closely, this spells out Hasar, means the prince, the noble one, or perhaps the baron, Asher, Anshel, Edoim, Mogain, and it's been highlighted helpfully by the author here, but that reflects the highlighting which appears in the original text, which you can see on the previous page, which means Asher Anshel, that was Rothschild's Jewish name. Edoim, Mogain means the red shield. And the second column says Shalom Loi, peace be upon him. So while it is singing his praises, it's mentioning his name. This acrostic form is a style that developed in medieval Jewish liturgical poetry, and we're familiar with it from some forms of poetry that are retained in our liturgy. So you can see that he begins in this rather obsequious, somewhat unctuous way, but with a messianic understanding of Rothschild's potential role, which he wishes to convey to him. Now, the next bit, the last part we're going to see in Hebrew, is called Tochen HaMavukash, which is, I've translated, if you look at the top of page 4, the content of the request. And this, if you go back to the original on the page 2, you'll have seen this appears on the top right in the original, Kalischer's original handwriting. So, Lo lichvoidi v'lo lichvoid beis avi bossi. I come not, and I have taken some license because it's really in the past tense, for the honour nor the honour of my father's house. Lo betza kesef v'lo helvosoi tefilossi. My prayer is neither monetary gain nor a loan of money, because I suppose that everyone who approached Rothschild was asking for money, although it's not quite true, as you will see later on. Ach Yeshuas nitche amenu bikashti. Rather, I request the salvation of the exiles of my people. V'seida avoda Yerushalayim darishti. I request the return of the order of the divine service to Jerusalem. As I mentioned, for Kalischer, the primary purpose was to go back to the land and begin to observe Judaism in its full biblical form, which includes the sacrificial order. With these, the yearnings of my heart, to him I shall turn. This is talking about Rothschild. Kanesha agozolov kanofov yifrois, and these are all replete with biblical imagery. He will spread his wings like an eagle over its chicks. This is the protective image, i.e., this messianic idea that Rothschild will somehow protect his people. The eil Elyon yanchenu b'margale tzedek. And God on high will set him in circles of justice, meaning give a fantastic reward. Hoshea Hashem es Mashiachoi poel tzedek. The God will save his Messiah, the one who works acts of righteousness. So here you see that he sees Rothschild in a messianic guise. Hasar, and who are we talking about in case you weren't clear? Hasar asher anshel edoi mogen shalom loi. The prince Asher Anshel of the red shield, peace to him. And you can see that that's the acrostic that is spelt out in the little poem that precedes the text. So you get some sense of what he's doing. What we don't know yet is exactly what he wants. And Kalischer does not get to the point quickly. Very near the beginning of the essay, however, and we're now in the excerpts which begin on page 4, and I've only selected 4 pieces directly from excerpts, and these are all from Jodie Meyer's translation, and in her excellent book, Seeking Zion. I've picked 4 excerpts. As I said, 8 or 9 pages of the letter deal with technical stuff. There's also a lot of kind of praise and ongoing kind of massaging, if you like, of Rothschild's ego. But there are 3 or 4 really key points which tell us what he wanted and his attitude, and we might consider how this was a precursor, or as I said, Proto-Zionism, a precursor to what became the movement that created the State of Israel in due course. So here we have these 4 excerpts. I'll read them and then discuss. So we're now in section E on page 4. The redemption of Israel and the righteous Messiah, whom we constantly await. Do not imagine that God, blessed be his name, will suddenly descend from on high and say to his people, go forth, or that we send his Messiah without warning from heaven to blow the great shofar and gather the scattered of Israel and surround Jerusalem with a wall of fire, as he promised through his servants, the prophets. Not so. Certainly all the promises of the prophets will be fulfilled in the end of days, as the redemption is completed. But we will not go swiftly or hastily in one day. The redemption of Israel will come gradually. Salvation will slowly flower, until finally Israel will wax strong and flourish, and all signs and promises of the holy prophets will come to pass. All this I will clarify for you with God's help through proof texts and the prophets and reason. Oh, and he does, and he spends a long time discussing it. But this is the first substantive point, which appears on the 3rd page in the printed edition, which I have, of Kalischer's letter. That unlike very many of his contemporaries, what we would call today the Haredi rabbinate, the Haredi view on this issue, we do not sit and wait for it to happen, tolerating the vicissitudes of exile. We have an obligation, if we are possible, to engage in activism to bring about the messianic redemption. It's not a temple that drops from the sky. That's a Gemara and Megillah. That's an allegory. It's not the world changes radically in some form which is beyond our control. Here Kalischer adopts a Maimonidean approach in which the Messianic era is effectively one of political and religious change, but nothing existential. And we have the power in our hands. In fact, we have the obligation to utilize that power to bring about the Messianic era, of which, of course, the return to the land of Israel and the rebuilding of the temple, for Kalischer at least, is absolutely central. And so the first substantive point in his essay, or it's really an essay in the form of a letter, is that we don't sit and wait. We have to actually engage in activism to bring about the future redemption of the Jewish people. And he continues, redemption will begin through natural causes, through human actions, and through the will of the kings to bring together a few of the scattered of Israel to the Holy Land, like Cyrus did. This is a reference to the event at the beginning of the book of Ezra, which ushered in the Second Temple period. One day, the king Cyrus wakes up. He's had a dream or a vision or some kind of moment of inspiration. The Spirit of God descends on him, and he allows a limited number of people who are Jewish exiles to return to the land, and that is the subject. What happens is the subject of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in Kesuvim, in the prophetic writings. And so the future redemption will occur when God stirs the Gentile kings to send out the Jews. And of course, this is remarkably prophetic. Here Kalischer presages what happens with the Balfour Declaration and the subsequent San Remo Conference in the 1920s, that somehow or other the rulers of the world feel stirred or motivated to move in a direction of allowing the Jews a land of our own. When a larger number of the remnants of Israel accumulate in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, remember he said it would be slow, a few would go back, there would be a trickle which would become a flood, and they repair the destroyed altar and offer a sacrifice as a savoury smell to God. Again, Kalischer, the centrality of the re-establishing of the sacrificial order. Then the Lord will be pleased to send the light of his countenance to descend upon his people, for certainly when we appeal to God through a sacrifice, we become cleansed of all our sins, and God will once again be merciful to us and bring the complete redemption and eternal happiness. So for Kalischer to bring about the complete redemption, the final realization of the Jewish dream in the land, we need first the atoning instrument of the temple and the sacrificial order. At that time, the wars over the land of Israel will occur, the wars of Gog and Magog, mentioned in the book of Yechezkel, and then God's Messiah and all his holy minions and God will rejoice in his creation and alone rule over all humanity, drawing some tropes from the davening for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The key thing again is that we don't sit and wait for it to happen, nor are we capable of bringing a full messianic redemption ourselves. We have to do what we can. We have to try to go back to the land. We have to try and rebuild the temple, which enables us to come close to God, and then God will do the rest. As this doesn't really conform with the later forms of Zionism, particularly, of course, those which were not motivated by religious interests, but even amongst the religious Zionists, some of them distance themselves from Kalischer's very obvious Messianism. Then, in the printed edition that I have, on page 13 of a 14-page letter, by which we wonder whether Rothschild actually got to this bit because it's so long, although I did read the entire thing. Perhaps God has great success in store for you. This is now addressing Rothschild directly. At this time in particular, when the land of Israel is not ruled by a powerful ruler as it was in the previous years under the Roman ruler and the government of the great Yishmaelite Muslim ruler, the Turkish Sultan, and he says they're Turkish Sultan in Yiddish letters, just in case Rothschild didn't know what he was talking about. The reference we'll come back to, but it's quite significant that the 1830s was an Ace Rotzen, a particular propitious time for this endeavour, because for a period the Turkish Sultan had lost control of the land of Israel to the Pasha of Egypt. More of that to follow. This is not the case now when the land is governed by the Pasha. That's the vassal of the Ottoman Empire ruling Egypt. Perhaps it would be acceptable to him if my lord, friend of the Most High, would shower him with a great fortune and buy him another country in exchange for the land. Suddenly, Kalischer says what he wants. He wants Rothschild to buy Eretz Yisrael from the Ottomans, or from the Pasha, the Ottomans' vassal. Buy him another country. Do a land swap. Find some land somewhere. Give it to the Pasha in exchange for Eretz Yisrael. Presently insignificant in size, but vast in quality. So he's going to have to find a comparable land. And this is his great idea, which sounds to a modern ear as utterly mad. Go to the ruler of Egypt and say, a Jewish banker would like to buy Eretz Yisrael from you, and the way he's going to buy it is by switching it for a land of equivalent quality. That's his idea. And then he talks a bit further in this paragraph on page 13 of the printed edition. And then, acknowledging this might quite not work, but if that ruler does not want to sell him the entire land, then maybe he will sell Jerusalem and its surroundings, and if perchance that ruler does not want to sell the city of Jerusalem, at the very least buy from the site of the destroyed temple and a plot of land next to it, and with the condition that liberties and permission should be given to the Jews to do there as they wish, to gather there from all lands without any obstacles, high taxes or oppression from the ruler of the country, in order that we may offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But the first way brings more honour and is worthier. So Kalischer has got plan B. If it doesn't work, perhaps the Pasha will sell Jerusalem or do a land swap for Jerusalem. If that won't work, at least the temple site, because as we've said, for Kalischer, being able to return to the land to offer sacrifices is the key idea. You will notice that he does not make any particular reference to Jewish sovereignty, something which we identify very strongly with Zionism. He does not make any reference to draining the swamps, to agricultural endeavour. He just doesn't talk about these things at all, certainly not here. And his interest in sacrifices is so central that later on in the 1850s and 1860s, he writes to some of the greatest rabbis in the world, including, interestingly, Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler, who was then the chief rabbi in the UK, asking their opinion as to whether in the absence of a temple or with certain other restrictions it might be permitted or perhaps obligatory to offer sacrifices. And of course, most people assume that it was simply impossible because the rulers of the land would never allow it. But as a theoretical construct, it met with some favourable responses, including from Rabbi Adler. And then a paragraph quite near the end before he goes back to all the honorifics. Considering this matter rationally, this investment would not be a total loss, but will bear fruit and increase. So Rothschild, it's a good investment. You're a banker. He now speaks to him as an investor. The leading Jews from all over the world will gather together and make the land of Israel a settled land, full of many Jews, for without a doubt there will be many rich, pious Jews from all over who will travel there for an honoured burial in holy soil, under a Jewish government. And that's the first reference here to Jewish sovereignty, which he had not made any reference to before. But presumably, and it seems as though what he's actually suggesting is that Rothschild might even become the ruler. It'll be his land, and he'll be the kind of, governor or even melech, king of the land. And also to merit their part of the savoury smell of the sacrifice, meaning to participate as members of the Jewish people in the communal offerings accepted by God on the altar, misspelt there. I scanned this text. And just as a flock increases under a person's guidance, without a doubt his wealth will quadruple, as will his righteousness without measure. To summarise, we don't sit and wait for the Messiah to come. We must be active and partner with God, do the best we can, build the temple, and God will do the rest. Rothschild's role as a very wealthy man, in an almost messianic guise, to find a way of wresting the land, buying it, or doing a land swap with the Pasha of Egypt, and if not Jerusalem, if not the Temple Mount, so that the Jewish people can come there and begin the process of reconciliation with God from the exile. And if you think it's a poor investment, you ask me to throw your money away on some poor quality land. Don't worry. The wealthiest Jews will come from all over the world, and your investment will be doubled and quadrupled. This is a summary and some excerpts of the absolutely extraordinary letter written by Kalischer. It just seems to be absolutely amazing in 1836, but the timing is also very significant, and there was a lot of messianic fervour at that time. There are mystical texts. There are mystical texts that kind of identify the year. We saw here that the year in which the letter was written, let me just look back in the papers, the letter was written in 5596. This is just 3 years before the millennium, and that millennium was treated as an opportunity for somehow the well springs of redemption to open. It's a way of reading Zoharic texts, mystical texts. It's not just that there's a lot of messianic fervour, there's a lot of turmoil in Europe. We are looking in the backdrop of the growth of the Enlightenment and the Reform movement, which Kalischer has much to say about. That's not for now. But as I said, it's particularly propitious at this time because of the Pasha's rule of Egypt, of the Pasha of Egypt's rule of the land of Israel, which we'll come to in a moment. But it is an absolutely extraordinary letter. It is like someone writing to Mark Zuckerberg, one of the wealthiest Jewish businessmen in the world, and asking him as a request of this sort. Although it is true, Rothschild was known by the religious Jewish society as Der Fromme Rothschild, because he was known to be observant, or at least very sympathetic to full observance, probably very observant himself. Now, a few observations. And the works I've already mentioned, Jody Myers, and there are a couple of other works which I've cited in the bibliography on the final page on the next page. In section F, a few observations and some analysis. So here we have Jody Myers, Seeking Zion. The translated excerpts are also from here, but here are some of her analysis. We've covered these, but I think it's worth looking at. Kalischer is referring here to Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, since 1805, and a vassal of the Turkish Sultan. In 1832, please forgive me, I have scanned these texts, there are a few infidelities. Muhammad Ali wrested control of the Sinai Desert, Palestine, Lebanon, portions of Syria from Ottoman hegemony. He then instituted reforms that significantly improved administration and law enforcement in Egypt and the provinces. The Jews of Palestine, especially those in Jerusalem, benefited considerably from the consequent reduction in violence and bribery, and they broadcast their relief by hailing Muhammad Ali's conquest as the beginning of a better era. This situation may have sparked Kalischer's belief that he was living at a time ripe with messianic possibilities. He felt that the ruling regime in Palestine was more inclined to give up land than it had been at any time in the previous 2,000 years. he sees Muhammad Ali as an opportunist, a man who might take the money and run, and it's the first time that someone has been ruling the land for a very, very long time who's in that position. When we consider Kalischer's political planning context, it's far less fantastic than outrageous than it might at first sound. To our ear, this sounds like a fanciful, almost crazy idea, and it is worth knowing, and we're going to cover this shortly. There is no known response from Rothschild. To the best of our knowledge, Rothschild ignored the letter. Widespread ignorance of Palestine and its Muslim rulers and inhabitants was the norm for Europeans. Kalischer's knowledge of the country was probably typical of the well-read European adult. Jews also received information through personal letters and from emissaries sent to raise funds for the Yishuv, as the Jewish community in Palestine was known. None of these sources provided a very realistic or detailed account of Near Eastern society. However, Kalischer was familiar with them, and so he probably knew more about the political situation than most Jews. And so it perhaps wasn't quite as crazy as it sounds. To give some context, Kalischer writes just ahead of what is a planned trip, although he never makes it because he falls into ill health and never actually gets to the land, sadly, despite his intentions towards the end of his life. Kalischer writes, and he asks whether Jaffa, which then was a mixed Jewish and Arab town before the construction of Tel Aviv, which was much later, whether Jaffa was within the boundaries of biblical Eretz Yisrael, which he needed to know in terms of tithes. Now, we know, because we know where Jaffa is, we have a map available, we know it most certainly is, but it's just interesting that he needed to ask this question ahead of his potential arrival. Myers continues, what is perhaps most intriguing about this argument is its connection to Jewish sovereignty, which he only mentions very briefly about the notion of Jewish government towards the end of the letter to Rothschild, as we saw above. In the above passage, Kalischer asserts that the purchased land will be under a Jewish government. That's the final paragraph that we cited on the previous page. And at the same time, Rothschild's private enterprise. This would occur, he explains, at the instigation of the world rulers. Eternal happiness will be his because the good of Israel depends on him, and all the kings of the earth will grant him majestic kingship, for they will rejoice in his greatness. That's an excerpt that we didn't see. Extraordinary. Rothschild's ascension to royalty in this manner will be a natural and peaceful progression of events. This passage indicates some seriousness in identifying Rothschild as the Messiah. This scenario fits his description of the Messiah as a righteous man who arises and rules over the Jews and subjects them in his land to the laws of the Torah and restores sacrificial worship to Jerusalem. This is a very Maimonidean understanding. If you look in the last couple of chapters of the Rambam's great work, the Yad Chazokah, this is the kind of style in which the Rambam describes the Messianic era. Yet establishing Jewish sovereignty was not Kalischer's goal or even major concern. It appears as a passing remark designed to strengthen the proposal's appeal. He did not seek a Jewish state for its own sake, or as Zionists would later argue, and of course inevitably Kalischer has been appropriated by all kinds of groups, as it were their founding father, founding thinker, long before Rav Kook was on the scene. He did not seek a Jewish state for its own sake, or as the Zionists would later argue, for the normalization of Jewish status. For him, the establishment of a Jewish kingdom was but one of many steps in the journey to full redemption. He is a redemptive Messianic Zionist, but he is nonetheless a forerunner of very great things to come and an inspiration for many people. Now, in an academic article by someone called Chaim Waxman, Messianism, Zionism and the State of Israel, Waxman contributes as follows. Although Rothschild's response, if any, is unknown, it is known that Kalischer subsequently wrote to Sir Moses Montefiore, apparently in 1839, and also to Albert Cohen, the Gabbai Tzedakah, manager of philanthropic funds of the Rothschild family in Paris. This would suggest that Rothschild did not directly respond or respond at all, and Kalischer is sending a follow-up and a reminder to one of his employees. In the same year, 1860, Kalischer joined an organisation founded by Dr. Chaim Lurie, the Society for the Colonization of Palestine, in Frankfurt on the Oder. Finally, in 1862, Kalischer's major and highly influential work, Drishas Tzion, was published, and it came to be a seminal work in the literature of religious Zionism. It's widely studied in Zionist circles in Israel today. The uniqueness of Kalischer's Messianism, as indicated above, lies in his espousal of the natural process of the redemption, and the fact that he combined, i.e. not a Messiah or a temple that falls from the sky, but as a product of human activism partnered with God. And the fact that he combined his vision with pragmatism, that is, he suggested specific ways to settle the land and undertook efforts to realise those suggestions. He not only wrote to wealthy Jews in an effort to enlist their financial assistance in building up the land, he also detailed the directions which that building should take. It is significant that two of his suggestions, the establishment of an agricultural cooperative as the economic foundation of settlement and the establishment of an agricultural school in Eretz Yisrael, were both seconded by Moses Hess and became realities in later years. These were suggestions that did not appear in this letter but were made in subsequent communications. The latter was realised when the Alliance Israélite Universelle founded the well-known agricultural school Mikveh Israel in 1870, and the former with the adoption by the Palestine Office of the World Zionist Organization of an emphasis on agricultural development in the early 1900s. So whether exactly his intention, and clearly not his direct focus, agricultural settlement are on his agenda, Jewish government is really a way of supporting or encouraging Rothschild to play his game, but nonetheless his ideas and writings were taken as an inspiration for those who followed him. Our final excerpt is from a piece published in Tradition, which is an American Orthodox publication in the 60s by someone called Aryeh Newman who learnt in Gateshead. It's called Hirsch Kalischer, Father of the Third Return to Zion, because there already had been waves in the 1830s, first two waves of Aliyah from Europe, and Newman sees Kalischer as the sort of founding father of the third wave of Aliyah, as it's known. Few realise today how much the third return to Zion owes to the work of a militantly Orthodox rabbi, a devout and erudite Talmudist, whose patriarchal beard, flowing earlocks and long black coat stamped him out as a member of an age gone by, rather than as a visionary, amazingly ahead of his contemporaries. The Chovavei Tzion, the lovers of Zion, the first Jewish colonists to till the soil of Palestine, and Herzl himself, built on the foundation laid by this unusual rabbinic personality. Kalischer had no illusions about the probable reaction to his letter. It's very interesting. He obviously, according to Newman, he never imagined Rothschild would actually do it, but it was to kickstart a conversation which gradually became a trickle and a flood of interest. And according to Newman, he was extremely influential, albeit indirectly, on the direction and credibility of Zionism, certainly amongst a religious crowd. At its beginning, he writes, "It terrifies me to think that you will, God forbid, take me for a charlatan, a madman, who is asking the impossible," which means he recognises this sounds like a mad request. He comforted himself, however, with the thought that since the subject of his request was the redemption of Israel, for which he was ready to sacrifice not only his substance but his very life, the possible contempt that might ensue was of no material consequence to him. Even if he did not achieve his objective, at any rate, the seeking to attain it was itself meritorious, meaning he felt an obligation to try, even if it was unsuccessful. The Baron did not even take the trouble to reply. Kalischer's preoccupation with the redemption did not preclude an extensive and heroic defence of traditional Jewish beliefs and observances in polemics with leaders of Reform Judaism. The disciples of Mendelssohn, eager to emancipate Jews from what they regarded as obscurantist medieval Judaism, sought to attune Judaism to the universalist ideas of the New Enlightenment. To them, the Messiah was only a symbol of the golden age of brotherhood, and Jerusalem was to be found in Berlin, the seat of progressive thought. While Kalischer was not alone in his battle, he was the only one to consistently decouple his attacks on the reformers with a practical diagnosis and treatment, Zion. So Newman goes away from this subject. He doesn't dwell on his Kalischer's fairly aggressive correspondence about reform leadership, as the reform movement is growing at this time. But he understands that he has a practical antidote, that the return to Zion, and it's interesting to put it in its place, because the early reform movement, and that has changed, but the early reform movement was resolutely universalist. It rejected the ideas of prayers to return to Jerusalem, returns to the land of Israel, and many early reform leaders were quite anti-Zionist. They felt that it was somehow a betrayal of universalist ideas. And Kalischer saw this, and part of his battle with non-traditional alternatives to traditional Judaism was the return to Zion, which appeared to have been rejected by the leaders of these new movements. And so there's much to say about Kalischer, and we could return to him and look at some of his other writings on another occasion, perhaps look at the Drishat Zion, which we haven't actually looked at in any detail. But the goal of this, as we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut this year, was to look at some of the background, some of the fascinating characters who so influenced not just rabbinic writings, writers like Rav Kook and other thinkers who have so influenced the religious Zionist world, but this notion of a return to Zion, stimulated by people, a land that was to be tilled and to be worked and eventually developed, the idea of a Jewish government, the idea that Jewish financiers would involve themselves in this project in the interest of the Jewish people. In this, Kalischer was perhaps one of the earliest and greatest Proto-Zionists, one of the most important thinkers, and perhaps on Yom HaAtzmaut someone we should remember, because I think that without these ideas, many of which have been long forgotten, some of the crystallization of the thought with which we're so familiar, which so influenced what happened subsequently, might well never have happened.